Welcome to the Central School of English Stage 5 video series. In this video, we will learn and practice the different uses of the modal verbs should and must. We can use both the modal verb should and the modal verb must to communicate advice or recommendations. We can also use the modal verbs should and must to speak about obligations. The modal verb should is always followed by the infinitive of a main verb. For example, to make a positive statement using the modal verb should and the main verb eat, we can say, I should eat, you should eat, he should eat, she should eat, it should eat, we should eat, you should eat, they should eat. To make a negative sentence using the modal verb should and the main verb eat, we can say, I shouldn't eat, you shouldn't eat, he shouldn't eat, she shouldn't eat, it shouldn't eat, we shouldn't eat, you shouldn't eat, they shouldn't eat. In English, we use the modal verbs should when we want to give advice or make recommendations. For example, if your friend says, I have a headache, you can give them some advice. You might say, you should take an aspirin. You should drink some water. You should lie down and rest. If your friend has a job interview in the morning, you might say, you should wear nice clothes. You should arrive on time. You shouldn't arrive late. If your friend wants to learn English, you might give them advice and say, you should go to an English school. You should listen to English music. You shouldn't speak your language at home. Now, let's look at how to make sentences using the modal verb must. When we use the modal verb must, we must always follow the modal verb with the infinitive of a main verb. For example, to make a positive statement with the modal verb must and the main verb go, we can say, I must go, you must go, he must go, she must go, it must go, we must go, you must go, they must go. To make a negative statement using the modal verb and the infinitive of the main verb go, we can say, I mustn't go, you mustn't go, he mustn't go, she mustn't go, it mustn't go, we mustn't go, you mustn't go, they mustn't go. In English, we can also use the modal verb must to give advice or to make a recommendation. However, when we use the modal verb must to give advice or to make a recommendation, we are giving strong advice or making a strong recommendation. When we use must, we are giving a stronger recommendation than if we used should. For example, you must see the film. It's amazing. You must visit the cliffs of Moher. They are beautiful. John must apply for the job. He is perfect for it. You must try Irish coffee. It is delicious. We also use the modal verb should and must to communicate an obligation. However, there is a small difference in meaning between the modal verbs should and must to communicate an obligation. When we say that we should do something, this means that we have an obligation to do this. However, when we use the modal verb should to indicate an obligation, there is an alternative to doing an action. When we use the modal verb must to communicate an obligation, there is no alternative. Let's look at how to use should to communicate an obligation. For example, we may say, I should pay my phone bill today. In this sentence, the speaker has an obligation to pay their phone bill. However, the speaker also has the alternative of paying the bill tomorrow or next week. To say, I should go to the supermarket, means that the speaker has an obligation to go to the supermarket. However, the speaker also has the alternative of going to the supermarket at a later time. To say, people should recycle, means that recycling is the right thing to do. However, there is no law to say that people have to recycle. People have an alternative. To say that people should vote in elections means that people have an obligation to vote in elections. Voting in elections is the right thing to do. However, using the modal verb should in this sentence means that people have an alternative. We use the modal verb must to communicate a strong obligation to do something. When we use the modal verb must, we communicate that the speaker has no alternative. We often use the modal verb must to communicate obligation as the result of a law or rule. For example, we can say drivers must wear a seatbelt. In this sentence, we use the modal verb must because drivers do not have an alternative. Wearing a seatbelt is the law. We can also say, airline passengers must have a passport. In this sentence, we use the modal verb must because airline passengers do not have an alternative. Having a passport is the law. We could also say, workers must pay taxes to the state. In this sentence, we use the modal verb must because workers do not have an alternative. Paying taxes is the law of the state. In this video, we have learned how to use the modal verbs should and must with the infinitive of a main verb to make positive sentences and negative sentences. We have learned that we use the modal verb should to give advice or to make recommendations, and that we use must to make strong recommendations. We have also learned that we use the modal verb should to express an obligation when we have an alternative, and that we use the modal verb must to express an obligation when we do not have an alternative. This lesson was brought to you by the Central School of English, an English school in Dublin. For more lessons, visit centralschool.ie.